What is spiritual formation? What is it exactly? Is it similar or different than discipleship? And who is having this conversation about spiritual formation anyways? This is what we're talking about today on the Attaching to God podcast. Does spiritual formation have a future? As always, we are produced by Embodied Faith. I'm your host, Geoff Holsclaw, and we are exploring a neuroscience-informed spiritual formation. I got my Cubs hat on for those of you who are watching on YouTube because baseball season is almost here, where hope springs eternal for all of you Cubs fan and other fans. And I just found out that Kyle, our guest, Dr. Kyle Strobel, is also, well, I don't know if you are a Cubs fan, but you recognize my hat, so that's great. Our guest today is Dr. Kyle Strobel, who is the director of the Institute for Spiritual Formation and is also an associate professor of spiritual theology at Talbot School of Theology, which is based within Biola University down in lovely Southern California. He writes books and teaches in the area of spiritual formation, and most recently has co-authored a book called Where Prayer Becomes Real, subtitled How Honesty with God Transforms Your Soul. Dr. Strobel, thank you so much for being on with us today.
Hey, Jeff. Good to be with you, man. I'm happy to do it.
Yeah, well, I reached out to you because you had this post, I don't know, a couple weeks or a couple months ago called The Future of Spiritual Formation. I was like, I got to talk to him about that. So you kind of proposed a couple things for moving the conversation forward, but I kind of want to backfill for some of our listeners who don't know who you are or don't even know that there's a thing called the spiritual formation movement, which had like recently a secret summit, you know. So you could fill that in, but you and I think are both, we were trained as systematic theologians, but now we're kind of in different fields. People probably know my history a little bit, but how did you get into what you're doing? You started teaching something maybe that was off topic, maybe from what you thought, but you kind of see it as being really helpful for you. At least I think.
No, this has been one of the great gifts God has given me is teaching in this area and not just slotting me into a kind of traditional systematic theology track. I have a really eclectic background. So originally Bible, so I was an undergrad Bible major and I did a master's in New Testament. And the plan was I'm going to go on to do a PhD in either New Testament or biblical theology. I had done a philosophy degree along the way. My first master's was in philosophy. So
philosophy.
I was interested maybe I'm going to go in that route. And it was right around this time that when I was a student at Talbot, our Institute for Spiritual Formation began to start. And I had never seen anything like it, and I kind of had begun to realize simultaneously that whatever guild I was trying to situate myself in, I just had different questions. And I was struck by kind of existential questions. I wanted to understand growth. I wanted to understand life with God. I had been mentored by people Willard mentored, and so Dallas Willard, both directly and then indirectly through them, had a huge impact on my life. And I began to study in our institute, which brought together some psychologists, some philosophers, and some theologians, all to wrestle together around the question of human formation and growth in the Lord. And when I did that, I was just like, I didn't even know you could do this. Like, this is what I want to do. And so I left there to do a PhD in theology because it was my conviction then, and it remains to be now, that the biggest problem that the spiritual formation conversation has is it tends to be theologically illiterate. And there is a kind of gap in spiritual theology and it is the theology, and we often just insert other things in that instead of doing theology. And so I went off and I ended up doing my PhD in Jonathan Edwards. So those of you who don't know Jonathan Edwards, he was an 18th century, we tend to call him American, although technically he was British. The war hadn't happened yet. It feels a little bit more American just to kind of own him.
Jonathan Edwards away from us?
Well, we got to own him.
He's the great American theologian that, I mean, some people do not like him, but at least he's like, oh man, I have to rethink my whole church history in America now. All right. Continue.
So I studied Edwards, and, in part it was because I wanted to study someone and Edwards is really the last wave of people where theology and spirituality were one thing, not two. And before the Enlightenment, it kind of eradicated the experiential dynamics of theology. And so I studied Edwards, and my plan was to kind of, just teach theology that was experientially kind of infused. And then I got hired by Talbot to do spiritual theology. And so At Talbot, every seminary student in general has to do a year and a half of spiritual theology. But then at the Institute, we have our own programs. And we don't let other seminary students take our programs, actually, because they're cohort-based, highly kind of vulnerable and experiential. So we kind of protect that. But we have a version of that every seminary student does take. And so I primarily teach in both of these contexts, and I get to integrate the questions of what does it mean to live before the face of God. So it's been pretty great.
And how do you see that as having been a providential move of God in your life, that you didn't get on a different track?
Oh, man.
You
No,
didn't
it's
get siloed with the nerdy systematic theologians.
Totally. It forced me, coming out of a PhD, I think the temptation is to teach students into a guild, because you inevitably come to take on the kind of virtues of the guild. And so a lot of my friends that have done that, the kind of goal of their teaching is to make students good readers of ancient texts.
Mm-hmm.
And I would be like, that's a good thing, I suppose. That's not a good ultimate end, though. Like, you could be a terrible reader of ancient texts and a wonderful theologian. And so I was forced to kind of get into these classes that were asking questions about, what does it mean to love my neighbor as myself? Or why do I fall asleep when I pray? Or why does my mind wander when I pray? And now I had to use all of my theological resources to kind of land the plane in the lived reality of life with God. And that's just been a gift. I wouldn't, there's so many important questions that are actually the questions people are asking that I could have just outsourced to someone else, because I don't have to deal with that in here. We're talking about Nicaea or something. Whereas I want to integrate it all together and really land the plane with the questions of people's lives. And so that has been a great gift to kind of force me to do that. Because unfortunately, in the academy, if we're not forced into some of these questions, we just won't ask them.
Yeah, for sure. Well, you talked about being gilded. The language I've heard sometimes is siloed, is that we have all these disciplines that are in their own little silos and they don't talk to each other. And is that really good for forming pastors or forming spiritual directors or even therapists and others, where everything has its own kind of world? So yeah, this whole podcast is kind of conceived as an interdisciplinary, if you want to use a fancy kind of language, endeavor where we get out of our silos. And we want to be really practical. So to be practical, a famous definition, if we're going to go into spiritual formation, we're going to shift gears now. Enough about you. Robert Mulholland, he has this famous definition of spiritual formation as the process of being formed into the image of Christ for the sake of others, which is great.
Yeah.
But what is, when you're starting a conversation or teaching about spiritual formation, how do you define it? How do you start that?
I actually love his definition. I usually use a little bit of a shorter definition, which is just the Spirit's work to form us into the likeness of Jesus. And I assume that is going to include for the sake of others, because it is in the likeness of Jesus. I use likeness language rather than image language because of how I understand the image of God, but that's kind of gets into kind of nerdy things, and I wouldn't overly worry about that. So I wouldn't be against his definition by any stretch, but that's how I normally do it.
All the listeners of this podcast who have any kind of inkling with Eastern Orthodoxy are like, I know what he's talking about. But for the rest of you, don't worry about it. We will continue on. Okay. So could you say that one more time? The Spirit's work?
The Spirit's work to form us into the likeness of Jesus.
Okay. I like that. Likeness of Jesus, not of Christ. But I like that too. So could you give, especially for those who maybe have no idea, like there is kind of a history of the spiritual formation movement, especially among evangelicals. Like there's kind of a different history among Catholics and blah. But if you could kind of fill that out a little bit as a way of setting the stage for a conversation about, well, what is the future for spiritual formation? So can you give us that history a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. So typically the current iteration, and part of my expertise is actually in the history of evangelical spirituality. So this is a conversation we've always had, but there's always these moments of ebb and flowing. And the newest conversation tends to be seen as starting around 1978. And that's when Richard Foster published Celebration of Discipline. And so Foster, who started Renovare.
That's also when I was born. I mean, that's kind of
That's when I was born. I just figured
there we go.
It was really more about our
get
births.
passed over. Yes, I know. what I'm talking about. I think we're fitting into the meanness of maybe contemporary spiritual formation. It all comes back to me, but okay, sorry about that. Okay, so 1978, we were both born, but Richard Foster also
He
did
also
what?
did something. Yeah.
Yeah.
So he publishes this book, and for Richard, the problem was he's looking at the church, and he's seeing a church that is becoming increasingly worldly, and they've just kind of accepted a very superficial vision of life with God. And no one was talking about things that we used to always talk about. So Richard was one that's saying, we used to talk about this. We used to talk about silence and solitude. We used to talk about contemplation. We're like, why aren't we talking about these things anymore? And so Richard publishes his book, and there's a lot of folks now think in terms of three waves of these things. And so the first wave of these kind of initial folks that come out, and really they're just saying there's a problem. We need to kind of come up with answers about what does formation actually look like. And then you have a wave of these kind of of publishing mostly, and you begin to see kind of institutions, and really that became more ministries start forming. And then you see this wave of the kind of institutionalization within the academy. And so, about 22, 23 years ago, the Institute for Spiritual Formation here was formed. Like, we're a part of that kind of wave, where now this is where we're assuming the question's a good one. We need to know what does it look like to be formed into the likeness of Jesus, right? What is the nature of the Christian life? What are the processes of developmental maturation? What are the directives of these things? Like, these are the kind of questions we have to wrestle through. And now these begin to be kind of institutionalized and encoded in the institution. And so we now are asking the question, a lot of us that are the next generation, like, well, in light of that, well, what's next? What is? And that's when we had our secret society meeting to figure all these things out.
Nice. All right. Well, so I think a question that I have and that some
Mhm.
people have is, well, how is spiritual formation different than discipleship? Did people stop talking about discipleship? If you were raised in the evangelical church,
Yeah.
certainly if you're over the age of 40, in your 50s or 60s, you're like, everyone I know, we always talked about discipleship. So how does the spiritual formation movement and this thing called discipleship, and are they the same? Are they different?
Yeah, no, it's hard to answer that question because I actually don't love the language of discipleship because it's become a kind of wax nose that you can form in whatever way you want. So when people use it, has no content to it. So it's, for some people it means doing apologetics. For some churches it means, studying, Westminster. For some churches it means doing spiritual practices. Like and others, a lot of it becomes mentoring or something like that. There's a lot of hard questions that we don't ask actually about disciple and discipleship language. And so on my Substack, I've been recently trying to wrestle with these things. Like, for instance, the word disciple is never used in the Bible after the book of Acts.
Mm-hmm.
That's not an insignificant reality that we have to grapple with. Like, why does Paul never use the word disciple? And what do we need to think about that? Why is it replaced with holiness language? We are saints. But more significantly, brother and sister, familial language. And so why do we grow up into Christ, who is our head, with a growth that is from God, as Paul says in Colossians 2:19? And in the parallel passage in Ephesians 4, it's growing up in love as every part is working properly. So it's a very communal, very familial dynamic. I think discipleship, I mean, I wouldn't want to get rid of the language. I don't think we need that. I don't think we need to go that far. But I do think most of the time when we use disciple categories and discipleship language, they tend to have nothing to do with what Scripture says.
Mm-hmm.
And in my mind, they are far too often what I would call pre-Pentecostal modes of spiritual formation. And by that, I mean,
I love it.
It ends up being, let's follow Jesus around Galilee as if he's our rabbi. Whereas I want to say, one, Jesus isn't your rabbi. Jesus is the ascended Lord of glory who's reigning at the right hand of God, in whose life you now live. And so whatever it looks like to follow Jesus, that has to be totally reimagined based on the ascension of Jesus back to the right hand of God. And so those categories shifted now to be post-Pentecostal categories of life in the Spirit. And so I want to shift things that way a little more deeply.
Yeah, I love that, the pre-Pentecostal. I know the idea of like, well, we need to do the things Jesus did as a follower of Rabbi Jesus. And the irony sometimes is that, especially when you look at like the Gospel of Mark, the disciples were called to be with him and then to be sent from him to do two things, which was to preach the gospel, which everybody loves, and to heal the sick and cast out the demons, which is like people often don't add when we talk about like the typical evangelical discipleship. That's why I'm a part of the Vineyard, so I had to sneak that in there because it's like if you're going to do what Jesus did, he kind of cast out the demons and healed the sick. I really like that too. You know, these words mean something different to so many different people. I do feel like the newer use of discipleship amongst people is more, it's just kind of interchangeable with spiritual formation oftentimes, because then they point back to the spiritual practices. But I do agree. I like what you said, like Jesus isn't just our rabbi. He's the risen, glorified Savior who died and conquered death, you know, and is coming again, right? And so that's different than, you know, he gave us a couple practices and wouldn't it be nice if we tried a little harder to follow him?
Totally.
He's like, I get in trouble because I changed Robert Mulholland's language from formation to conformation. Like we're being conformed to Christ. And, you know, Paul does speak that way too. I slipped that in there because I kind of like, I want to tweak people a little bit because it's a very non-Western, like, oh, it's okay to be formed. It's like, no, you're being conformed. Like, and that's usually a negative thing. But that's out on the side. So thank you for that brief history. What do you then see as like the future? Like, what do you feel? You kind of laid out these three movements of kind of the initial kind of like, hey, there's a problem here. Let's rediscover these things. And then I think you said, maybe I got this wrong too. Wave 2 was like books and ministries and kind of getting the word out. And then phase 3 is maybe the institutionalization. Was that right? So then what are your kind of hopes or maybe fears about the future of the spiritual formation conversation?
Yeah, I do have worries. I mean, I worry that it's being taken over by the evangelical industrial complex, and that we're always just republishing the same book over and over and over again, which is do a bunch of spiritual practices to grow. I worry that it is still atheological. And, you know, one of the questions I always ask if you're reading or listening to someone is, what is doing the work here? And I hear far too many people who just replace theology, which is going to be fixated on God and God's action, with pop psychology and sociology. And it just becomes this very thin, sort of self-helpy kind of thing, actually, that gravitates away from being fixated on God to like fixing my life. And so I really worry about those sorts of things. I do think to become more theological is going to lead us into being a little bit more ecclesial. Like one of the downsides of the current discussion is it really hasn't been able to speak meaningfully about life in the church. It's been a little too fixated on individuals. It's, I would say, often a little too interested in periphery issues. Like silence, solitude, great. We need to talk about that. But we also need to talk about listening to a sermon as one of the primal practices of a believer. Like the church service, in my mind, is not an arbitrary or insignificant reality. And yet, because it was obvious to the people that started writing in this area, we often don't talk about the things we take as obvious. But then, of course, as generations come along, they suddenly have taken on a vision that has absolutely nothing to do with the church and really can't answer why. And I think some of that stems from what the movement has tried to do, which I think is good for a movement to begin this way, is to do a kind of mere Christian vision of these things. The problem with being a mere Christian is you actually can't really minister to people deeply from that frame. Like at some point, you're going to have to address concrete issues that are going to require deeply theological and practical realities. And so if we stay in this very generic mode, we actually won't end up doing something deep and rich. And so we need to, what I would say is we need to re-tradition without losing the unity we have. Like that's the worry about traditioning is now we can begin to fight. Whereas I want to say, no, let's re-tradition, but let's continue moving forward with what the goods have been, which is one of the few places in the church today where we're highly invested an integrative account of life with Jesus. And so we need to keep doing philosophical work, psychological work, biblical work. We need to do more theological work. Let's do that. And then let's help each other. Like, I want to help you think, well, what does it mean to do this in the vineyard? That's going to be different than my church. That's going to be different for the Anglican. That's it. Like, let's help each other do those things well, but let's push into the harder questions, and let's push into the places where we actually are kind of rubbing up against each other, going, wow, you think it's like that? That's interesting, because I don't.
Yeah.
We could bless each other while disagreeing with each other in these things.
Yeah. So I was hearing a little bit that these are kind of the detriments, I think, rather than where we're going, which I want. But the communal life is kind of being forgotten. And I find that all the time where, we had someone leave our church several years ago, not because of COVID or the elections or anything, right? But their conviction was like, well, you don't preach the word enough, which is not true, actually, right? But the conviction, the feedback that this person got, which I thought, one of our associate pastors, she was great. She said, well, no, we're calling you to do the word in your life, and you don't like that. And it was like this really, like she was like, we've called you to move forward in these areas of your life and in the way you interacted with these people in these ministries that you're part of. And you don't like, and she's just like, I think that's why you're leaving, and you should stay and work out your sanctification, basically. But instead it was like, oh no, like, I don't want to work out my salvation with one another. I want to just kind of pick and choose this kind of consumer kind of idea. I think I run into another end, which is people who love the spiritual formation language kind of because it's detached from the church. And Sarah Coakley, she talks about armchair mystics and how people, are now talking about the spiritual practice of contemplation, silence and solitude. And it's intentionally divorced from the church, which, as I'm sure you know this, when you read the life of all these mystics that people are excited about, you're like, they didn't divorce themselves from the church or orthodoxy. Like, that was their center on which all this other stuff was built. But too often, I think we kind of grab bag these traditions and kind of just individualize them.
Totally. Yeah, Bernard McGinn, when he talks about this, I love a line he has where he says, in the Christian tradition, you will never find a mystic who sought out to be a mystic. You'll find mystics that became mystics because they wanted to be deeply Christian. And it's not until the 20th century that we find mystics wanting to be mystics. And he highlights the shift that has occurred where you have these people, divorcing themselves from the church, divorcing themselves from orthodoxy in order to enter into something they call mysticism. And he's saying you will just not find this anywhere in the Christian tradition.
Right. Well, that'd be another podcast, is mysticism and how it's kind of talked about these days. So could we talk a little bit more about that traditioning? Like what, because you also talk about, we don't need a mere spiritual formation. Like, and I kind of run into this sometimes. I'm always kind of, when I read spiritual formation books, I kind of wonder, do they have a theory of spirituality first before it's Christian? Totally. I'm always a little concerned when it's like, well, let's talk about human spirituality. Although I think we can do that to some extent. But then, that feels kind of like then spiritual formation is just this general container that then we put a couple of Christian things into it.
That's right. Yeah, and that's what worries me is I do think we can have we can talk about a lot actually in the mere category, the mere spiritual formation. But I mean, as an obvious example, I lean Reformed in my theology. A Reformed theology has a certain view of sin and a certain view of grace that's going to lead us to talk about spiritual practices as means of grace. Wesleyans are going to have a slightly different view of sin, slightly different views of grace, and it's all slight. It's all under the same umbrella. We're all brothers and sisters here. But that's going to lead to a slightly different way to think about means of grace and how they function. The pneumatology, for instance, right? You're going to have a theology of the Spirit in these different traditions. That's going to lead you to talk about different things. Some people, some traditions are going to push into power language more. Others are going to push into the Spirit as love more. I mean, you brought up Sarah Coakley. Sarah is going to have a particular interest in the apophatic, into kind of dark contemplation and this ancient tradition about God's holy otherness that leads us to be kind of really going to leads us into a kind of purgation because we need to be negated in order to kind of give ourselves to God. Well, all those things, like that makes a lot of sense in an Anglican tradition.
Mhm.
The Reformed don't do as much with that. Now, maybe it could be, well, we need to. So that's an interesting conversation to have. But a lot of these traditions, they're going to give us a theology of these things that leads us particularly to think about spiritual practices in certain ways, as well as give us certain kind of expectations about what is the kind of phenomenological texture of growth.
Mhm.
Like, what is growth like? And what should I anticipate? And therefore, what does it mean to kind of care for souls in light of that reality? Like and I shouldn't expect these are going to be massively different.
Mhm.
But if you look at a Catholic compared to a Protestant, there's going to be some huge differences there, right? When you have a certain view of mortal and venial sin and what that does to infuse grace and all these things that obviously on a lay level we're not even thinking about, but that's going to have massive ramifications for how you kind of guide a soul. And so I want to pay more attention to those things, because if we don't actually get really deep into our theology on this stuff, what'll happen is spiritual formation will become just natural formation.
Mhm.
The Spirit will just become the kind of psychological equivalent of Red Bull or something. And we're going to try to awaken our wills, infuse passion into our persons to just do things. And at the end of the day, I'm going to say this is just the world baptizing a kind of self-help strategy and naming it Christian when it isn't distinctively so.
Well, so let's dive into that. I was talking to a friend. He's Anglican, J.R. Roscoe. We were together in D.C. just last week, and he talks about spiritual formation, and he was leading this group through these practices. And at one point, he said, "Yeah, I made this comment that I thought was kind of like no duh, but people really tripped over it, which is these practices are not like a life hack. Like
Mm-hmm.
silence and solitude is not a
Totally.
life optimization path. Although some of the research says it is, right? So this is where it gets confusing. But that's just natural formation, though.
Sure.
So could you, because I talk about this tension between, you know, um, like spiritual formation and like our therapeutic culture. Like they're not
Mm-hmm.
totally opposed, but they're not also totally aligned.
Totally.
And so, how do you kind of see that trouble that maybe some of these practices or this way of thinking just ends up becoming a new kind of self help pathway?
Totally. Yeah, and it's hard because you're totally right about that. They're not totally contradictory, and yet there's contradictions within them that we have to kind of name. And I think the mistake that people make, I think, in this is that and there's a whole long story here in the 20th century, but we tend to reduce things down to natural formation very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And so we think that the Christian life is just becoming good and having a certain kind of life in certain sorts of ways. And so these practices end up just the kind of end of them, the goal of them becomes me having a certain kind of life rather than, and this goes back to the older language of means of grace, like if grace is God's self-gift, so to talk about grace is to talk about that God has given himself to you. The means of grace are first and foremost means of receiving from God, and to borrow Romans 12:1, of presenting my body as a living sacrifice to the Lord. Now, the sacrificial language there is important because the verb for sacrifice means to bring near. So what you're doing in a sacrifice is you are bringing yourself near. Spiritual practices, the telos, isn't my life. It's me handing myself to God in light of what he has done for me. And so we can get either end of that wrong. Like we can miss the foundation that God has given me and think that spiritual practices are somehow achieving that. Like I need to be good so God will receive me.
Right.
Or we can get the end wrong. And rather than giving myself to God, the goal could be fixing my life. But to your point, the reality is it kind of will fix your life. But you can fix your life and lose it, or you can lose your life for Christ's sake and find it, right? And that's where you're going to get the tensions in here. And the language, the tradition has a lot of language for this to talk about these things well. I'm actually working on a book with Lucy Peppiatt. I don't know if you know Lucy.
Oh, great. Sure.
Yeah. So Lucy's a dear friend of mine, and she and I are working on an edited volume on infusion in the Christian tradition, the Protestant tradition specifically. And infusion is the word we would use to differentiate natural growth, which is acquired. It's the things that we develop habits for, versus infused growth, which is based on God giving himself to us in infused grace. And so that distinction is going to be really important to kind of separate out the two ways we grow.
That's so good. I think the rub that, and you named it, with Romans 12:1 there, is to offer your body as a living sacrifice. That in certain circles, that's the rub, which is the therapeutic culture says, well, sacrificial language is bad. That's detrimental to building a positive self-image or self-esteem or self-acceptance, self-compassion.
Yeah.
And yet that's like very central to the Christian kind of formation language, is you are formed through dying. That in certain circles, that becomes a big tension in
Totally.
kind of our
Yeah,
kind of self-actualization still is technically the right word, just nobody uses it anymore. Well, so to keep it kind of practical, like, what is, going back to your definition, so it is the Spirit's work to form us, I didn't quite get the engine, to form us to be like Jesus. So what would be, how can we kind of sum up this for listeners? Like, what should spiritual formation be like if they're thinking about spiritual formation, their own spiritual formation, or these practices? Like, what is like the one thing you'd want to be sure to keep before them?
Yeah. The language I love that I keep going back to is the language of Hebrews. Therefore, draw near. You have been given access to the Father.
Boldly approach the throne.
Boldly ascend to the throne of grace, right? So there's, because of the work, and of course, the author of Hebrews is reflecting on Exodus, where the call is, don't draw near lest you die.
Yeah.
So Jesus has done something so that now it's boldly come near. And so these spiritual practices aren't there to fix your life. They're there to draw near to your Lord and to trust that it is true that your life is hidden with Christ in God, as Paul tells us in Colossians 3. And so if you want to find your life, you have to come to Jesus. And to use one of my favorite expressions of modern, the 20th century spiritual formation, coming from von Balthasar.
I love him.
At von Balthasar, he's like Chesterton in terms of when he gets a line, it just hits hard. And he says, at no amount of soul searching would Simon the fisherman have ever discovered Peter. The Lord had to speak that over him.
Right.
And so I would just
identity, a new vocation. It's brand new.
It's brand new. And so come to Jesus to find yourself.
Yeah.
And then, to borrow a bit of Luther, if you look at yourself apart from Christ, you're done for. So stop trying to look at yourself apart from Christ. Instead, look to Christ and find your life hidden with Christ in God. That is the invitation, I think.
Yeah. Amen. Well, to wrap it up to the themes of this podcast specifically, in our focus, like on attachment theory, attachment to God, like the idea of boldly approaching the throne of grace comes from the sense that we're a part of God's family. And so like little kids can barge into their dad's study because they're welcome at any time, even though I'm trying to get stuff done, right? but they barge in, and so we, if our primary attachment is to God, rather than the status or achievement or, possessions or other things, then, as a family member, so just for all of you listeners, it really stood out to me that shift from discipleship language, which you get especially in the Gospels, to saints language, but then also to people language, but then especially family language.
Yep.
And it is, who is your primary family? Who's your primary attachment? And that's what the formation is doing. I never forget my spiritual director was like, hey, Geoff, it's great if you're going to try to be better at fasting, but remember, you're supposed to love God and others. Like that's the goal. The goal isn't to be better at fasting. The goal is to love God and love others. And that these are just kind of different, well-tested centuries, millennia-long tested mechanisms to try to get at that love. As John Cassian said, it's the purity of heart that we're seeking so we can love God and receive God's love better. Well, any last thought before I let you go?
No, I just think that's wonderful. I think that's exactly right. It's we have to constantly keep before our view, and to borrow Cassian's language, since you turned to him, discretion is discern your calling and discern your vocation. Most of you aren't monks, would be my guess. Don't feel overburdened if you're a mom with 3 kids and you can't find silence and solitude and contemplation makes no sense for you. Be where the Lord has called you and draw near to him in everything he's given himself to you in. That is the call. It's not a call to be somewhere else, but it's a call to be with him where he has you.
Amen. We are seeking to attach to God, who is already attached to us. We love God because God first loved us. We don't have to earn all that. Well, so where can people keep track of you, or what are some of the work that you're up to?
Yeah, best place is Substack, which is just kylestrobel.substack.com. And you can subscribe for free. I do a lot of free stuff on there. I do some paid stuff on there. I'm, around on all the general social media stuff, although I'm terrible at it. And I'm kind of semi-proud of the fact that I'm terrible at it. So you won't find me on there all that much. I am busy working on all sorts of book projects right now. So I've got much coming down the chain, but it's, I'm in the midst of the crazy of that season. So
Nice. Very good. Well, we already talked before we started recording that you got some new things in the works, and so where did I put my note? Here we go. Philosophy, theology, and psychology. That's gonna be our next time when we have Dr. Strobel on. Well, thank you so much for your time, and we just love and appreciate everything you're doing.
Thanks, Geoff. Good to be with you, brother.